Imagine, you decided you needed a break from the busy city life. The routine was exhausting and work was stressful. So, you grabbed your hiking backpack and headed to a remote forest, where there was a crystal-clear river that you always wanted to visit. The plan was simple. Spend the weekend camping, disconnecting from the world and re-energizing yourself with nature. You carefully planned the trip, choosing a route that few knew about, thus guaranteeing the much-desired solitude. The trip began early in the morning, with the newly risen sun tinting the sky in golden hues. The trail was serene, surrounded by tall, ancient trees that seemed to hold ancient stories. The sound of birds was a soft melody, and the cool breeze brought the smell of damp earth. Every step you took was a release from the accumulated stress, and you felt lighter by the moment. After a few hours of hiking, the terrain began to get steeper and the vegetation thicker. That was when you saw it for the first time. He was standing on the trail, looking out of place in this natural setting. He was a scruffy-looking man, with dirty, wrinkled clothes, disheveled hair, and a restless expression. His eyes were wide and he was looking everywhere as if he was waiting for something or someone. You said a polite hello, but he just mumbled something unintelligible and slowly stepped aside, allowing you to pass. Something about him made you feel uneasy, but you dismissed that feeling, chalking it up to tiredness and lack of human interaction. Continuing along the trail, you finally reached the perfect spot to camp. The river ran gently along it, its clear waters reflecting the blue sky. The banks were covered in smooth rocks and green moss, and there was a small clearing where you could pitch your tent. The scenery was calmingly beautiful, and you quickly got into the business of setting up camp, feeling the tension slowly melt away. With the tent set up and the fire lit, you settled in for a quiet evening. Reading a book you brought, the sound of the river and the light breeze rustling the leaves created a relaxing atmosphere. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. You prepared a simple meal and felt satisfied with your choice to spend the weekend there. Everything seemed perfect. But as night fell and darkness took over the forest, you began to feel a slight uneasiness. It was nothing specific, just a feeling that something was wrong. The memory of the strange man on the path came back to you, and you wondered what he was doing there, so far away from everything. You tried to convince yourself that he was just a lone walker, perhaps someone who was also looking for peace and quiet. That was when you heard a sound. At first it was almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves. But soon it became clear that someone was approaching. You froze, eyes staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. And there he was, the same man from the path, standing a few feet away, with the same wide, brooding gaze. This time he seemed even more restless, shifting from foot to foot, as if he couldn't stay still. Your heart began to beat faster, and a feeling of impending danger took hold of you. Trying to remain calm, you asked him what he wanted. The man didn't answer, just continued to stare at you with those wide eyes. The surrounding atmosphere grew heavy, and the silence of the forest seemed to amplify every little sound. The crackling of the fire, the sound of the river in the background, and the pounding of your own heart were almost deafening. The situation was surreal. You were isolated, without any means of communication, with a potentially dangerous stranger. Finally, the man started to speak, but his words were disjointed, as if he was talking to himself or someone invisible. He was mumbling something about not being able to run away, and the others are coming. Each word was like a blow, increasing your fear and confusion. He was clearly distressed, and the situation was becoming untenable. You knew you needed to get out of there, but the fear of turning your back on him was paralyzing. Trying not to show panic, you began to gather your things, keeping an eye on the man all the while. He continued to mutter and move erratically, as if he was on the verge of collapse. The fire had nearly died down, casting dancing shadows around it, and the man seemed to transform into those shadows, becoming even more sinister. Suddenly he laughed. A low, haunting laugh that echoed through the woods. It was the most terrifying sound you had ever heard, filled with something you couldn't quite define. Desperation, madness, maybe even a veiled threat. That was enough for you. With everything packed up, you stood up, and with one last look at the man, you began to slowly walk away. He didn't try to follow, but the laughter continued, following him like a specter in the darkness. You walked quickly, almost running, back down the path. The silence of the forest now seemed oppressive, and every snap of a branch or every whisper of the wind made your heart race. With every step you looked back, afraid to see that man again. But the path was empty, only the sound of your own footsteps breaking the silence. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, you reached a safer spot where you knew you were relatively far from the stranger. You set up camp there, but the idea of sleeping was out of the question. You spent the night awake, ears open to any suspicious sound and eyes scanning the darkness. Every shadow seemed to move, every noise seemed like an approaching footstep. The feeling of being watched never went away. When the first ray of sunlight appeared on the horizon, you were ready to leave. You packed your things as quickly as possible and set off on the way back to civilization. The trip back was a mix of relief and tension, but the image of that man and his sinister laugh remained in your mind. Days later, still reflecting on the experience, you decided not to venture alone into such remote places again. The idea of encountering something so inexplicable and disturbing was too terrifying. And so, that journey that was supposed to be a haven of peace became a reminder that sometimes the solitude of nature can hide more than just wild animals. It can reveal dark secrets that are beyond human understanding. I hope you liked the story, because the second story is even more chilling. Just don't forget to see if you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories. You were ready for a break from the busy city life, longing for a few days of tranquility in nature. You chose a little-known trail, recommended by a friend as a perfect place for those seeking peace and silence. After a long week of work, the idea of getting lost in nature seemed like the best decision. So, you put on your backpack, grabbed a map, and set off on your adventure. The trail was truly beautiful and secluded. As you continued along, the sound of the city faded away, being replaced by the soft rustling of trees and the chirping of birds. The colors of the forest, with its vibrant greens and the occasional glimpse of wildflowers, brought a sense of renewal. You walked for hours, breathing in fresh air and appreciating every moment of peace. You finally found a small clearing that seemed ideal for setting up camp. The location was perfect. There was a stunning view of the valley and a small source of running water not far away. You quickly settled in, set up the tent, lit a small fire, and prepared a snack. The sun was setting and the orange hues of the sky were reflecting off the surrounding trees, creating a magical atmosphere. As you sat enjoying the sunset, you noticed a faint light up ahead. Curious, you decided to investigate. As you approached, you saw that it was a bonfire, and near it, an older man was sitting on a log. He seemed deep in thought, staring into the fire. You hesitated, but then thought that perhaps he was another nature lover, like you. You approached carefully, and the man finally looked up. He had a peculiar appearance: gray hair, a stubble beard, and eyes that seemed to contain an unusual depth. He introduced himself as Samuel and spoke in a calm, almost monotone manner. There was something in his tone and gaze that made you feel uncomfortable, but you decided to ignore it. They spoke briefly, and he mentioned being there for some personal reflection. The conversation didn't last long. It seemed that Samuel wasn't interested in socializing. As you returned to your tent, you couldn't get Samuel's figure out of your mind. There was something unsettling about him, but you convinced yourself it was just your imagination. After all, everyone has the right to seek peace in nature. You prepared to sleep, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave you alone. The night was progressing, and the sounds of the forest were getting louder. The wind was rustling the leaves and snapping the branches. Suddenly, you heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, like someone was cautiously moving around your tent. Your heart started to beat faster. Maybe it's an animal, you thought, trying to calm yourself down. But then, the shadow of a figure formed on the canvas of the tent. You froze. It was Samuel. He was standing silently outside, staring at the tent. Fear gripped you. What did he want? Why was he there? The silence became unbearable and every second seemed like an eternity. You tried to control your breathing, waiting for him to leave. But Samuel stood there, motionless, like a statue. Finally, he walked away. You heard his footsteps retreating, but the fear didn't subside. He decided he couldn't stay there. He quickly began gathering his things, trying to be as quiet as possible. The thought of spending the rest of the night in that place was unbearable. He grabbed his lantern, put out the fire, and started walking down the path, his heart still racing. The walk back to the car was an ordeal. Every sound seemed amplified by the silence of the night. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, even the sound of your own breathing seemed too loud. You felt watched, as if something or someone was hiding in the darkness, following your steps. Adrenaline made you walk faster, and you could barely think of anything else but getting out of there as quickly as possible. When you finally reached the car, the relief was immense. You quickly got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As you drove back to the city, the feeling of being chased still hung in the air. You looked in the rearview mirror expecting to see something or someone on the road, but you were alone. The experience left you shaken, and the thought of returning to that place would never cross your mind. Arriving home, you tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe Samuel was just a lonely man, lost in his own thoughts, but the sense of danger he felt was too real to ignore. The memory of the night, the footsteps, the shadow, and the eyes fixed on your tent continued to haunt you. Deep down, you knew that you would never forget that experience and that some things in the woods are best left unsolved. And so, even away from the trail and the woods, Samuel's shadow and the mystery of that night continued to haunt your thoughts. The city, with all its noise and movement, now seemed like a safe haven compared to the eerie silence of nature. Some mysteries, as you have learned, are best left unsolved. I hope you liked the story, because the third story is even more chilling. Just don't forget to see if you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories. I hope you liked the story. So, you decided to take a few days off and went camping in your RV, looking for peace and quiet. That little corner of the woods seemed perfect to me. It was a secluded spot, away from the city, where you could hear the sound of birdsong during the day and the gentle wind rustling the leaves. The forest had an air of mystery, with tall, ancient trees and a stream meandering through the rocks offering a soothing melody. You carefully set up camp and parked the trailer in a flat, spacious spot. After getting everything set up, you grabbed a chair and sat outside, enjoying the afternoon sun. It was then that you realized you weren't alone. Another camper had arrived. He seemed a little clumsy, struggling to put up a tent that seemed to be falling apart. His movements were strange, and you couldn't help but notice how nervous he seemed, looking around as if he was lost. He had a worn-out appearance, as if he had been through a lot of hardships along the way. You watched from afar, not wanting to get involved. After all, he was there to relax, and he didn't want to get involved in other people's problems. But that strange, uncomfortable figure of the other camper wouldn't leave his head. Night fell and the forest grew darker. The air became colder and the silence grew deeper. The only lights came from your trailer and the fire pit you had lit. As he stood outside looking at the stars, he began to feel uneasy. There was something in the air, a feeling that something wasn't right. Then, you looked over at the other camper's tent and noticed that it was empty. He had simply disappeared, leaving the tent open and his belongings scattered about. You tried not to think about it too much. Maybe he had gone out for a night walk or to get more firewood. But then, a chill ran down your spine. It was like someone was watching you. You turned your head slowly, looking into the darkness between the trees. It was then that you saw a shadowy figure, standing there, staring at you. The figure was partially hidden by the shadows, but you could see the eyes glowing in the darkness. It was an eerie presence, and you felt your heart beat faster. Who or what could it be? The other trailer? Someone else? Fear began to rise within you. You tried to remain calm, telling yourself that maybe it was just an animal or an illusion brought on by the darkness. But something about those eyes, the way the figure stood there, motionless, made you feel like you were being watched by something much more sinister. The silence of the forest seemed heavier, as if it was waiting for something. Without a second thought, you decided it was time to get out of there. You quickly began gathering your things, turned off the fire, and entered the trailer. The fear was palpable, as if at any moment something could come out of the shadows and reach you. As you packed your things, you couldn't stop looking back at the forest, where the shadowy figure had disappeared. What did she want? Why was she staring at you? You started the trailer's engine and began to drive out of there. The dirt road was narrow and winding, but that didn't matter. I just wanted to get away from that place as quickly as possible. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the woods getting further and further away. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Who or what was in those woods? Was it really just a lost caravan, or was there something more sinister lurking? The drive back was long and silent. The fear was still with you, clinging like a shadow. When he finally got home, he felt immense relief, but also a haunting curiosity. What really happened that night? Was the shadowy figure just a figment of his imagination, or was there something else in those woods, something he'd rather not know about? One thing was for sure, that experience would stay with you for a long time, a reminder that sometimes what we can't see can be the scariest thing of all. Tell me which story made your hair stand on end? Tell me which one you liked the most? Because in the next video the story is even more chilling. Just don't forget to see if you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories.